Have you ever noticed something strange? The people who reply the fastest, explain themselves the most, and try the hardest to be understood are almost never the ones with real power. But the people who stay silent, who walk away without drama, who don't rush to fix misunderstandings, somehow control the emotional atmosphere of every room. Today, I'm going to show you the dark side of influence. Not motivation, not confidence, not positive thinking. The art of ignoring people. This is not kindness psychology. This is not self-help psychology. This is ruthless emotional power, explained through Machiavellian thinking. And before you misunderstand me, this is not about becoming cruel. It is about understanding what silence does to the human mind. Because silence is not empty. Silence is pressure. Intro: why ignoring is so powerful. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Why does being ignored hurt more than being criticized? Think about it. Someone insults you. At least you still exist in their emotional world. But when someone ignores you, your mind starts attacking itself. You replay your words. You analyze your tone. You imagine hidden mistakes. You start lowering your own value in your head. Ignoring someone creates a psychological vacuum. And the human mind cannot tolerate emotional emptiness. That is the first dark truth. People don't fear rejection. They fear uncertainty. Machiavellian psychology is built on one simple observation. Human beings are controlled more by emotional discomfort than by logic. Ignoring someone creates discomfort without confrontation. No conflict. No argument. No evidence. Just silence. And silence forces the other person to supply their own explanation. That is where power begins. The first principle: ignoring removes your emotional availability. Most people give access to their emotions too cheaply. They reply instantly. They react instantly. They explain instantly. They defend instantly. This tells the other person one silent message: you have immediate access to my inner world. In social psychology, availability equals emotional accessibility, and emotional accessibility lowers perceived value. Not because you are worthless, but because the human brain associates effort with importance. Machiavellian thinking teaches something disturbing. People do not measure your worth by your intentions. They measure it by how difficult it is to emotionally reach you. When you ignore unnecessary messages, when you don't chase closure, when you don't rush to repair broken communication, you are not being arrogant. You are signaling emotional self-sufficiency, and emotional self-sufficiency is intimidating. Why? Because a person who does not emotionally depend on you cannot be controlled by your approval. That immediately changes the power structure. Why most men destroy their own power? Let me be brutally honest. Most men sabotage themselves the moment emotional tension appears. A woman becomes distant, a friend becomes cold, a colleague becomes passive-aggressive, and instantly the man wants to fix it. He sends longer messages. He explains his intentions. He tries to appear harmless. He overcommunicates. He believes clarity creates connection. But Machiavellian psychology understands something darker. Clarity reduces mystery. Mystery keeps emotional attention alive. When you rush to clear every misunderstanding, you remove the psychological tension that keeps you relevant. You also place yourself in a lower negotiating position, because now you are the one seeking emotional relief, not them. The second principle: ignoring forces the other person to chase meaning. The human mind hates unfinished emotional business. This is not romance psychology. This is cognitive discomfort. When someone expects a reaction and receives nothing, their brain goes into narrative building mode. They try to guess what you think. They try to interpret your silence. They imagine motives. They project emotions onto you. In simple words, they start doing the emotional work for you. That is ruthless efficiency. Machiavellian power is not about doing more. It is about letting others invest emotionally while you remain neutral. Silence is not absence. Silence becomes a canvas, and people paint their own fears and desires onto it. That is why ignoring someone often makes you appear colder, stronger, and more dominant, even if you are simply calm. The dangerous mistake: confusing ignoring with bitterness. Now let me stop you right here. There is a line. Ignoring someone because you are emotionally stable is powerful. Ignoring someone because you are wounded is transparent. People can feel emotional revenge. They can feel emotional hunger. True Machiavellian silence has one requirement: you must be internally detached. If your silence is filled with expectation, if you are waiting for their reaction, if you are checking your phone every minute, you are not ignoring. You are begging quietly, and the subconscious mind of the other person can sense that imbalance. Power only exists when you truly do not need the response. The third principle, ignoring destroys their leverage. Every relationship contains invisible emotional levers. Your attention, your approval, your emotional reactions, your explanations, your reassurance. The moment someone realizes that their behavior controls your emotional state, they hold leverage. They can become distant to pull you closer. They can become warm to pull your loyalty. They can withhold to gain compliance. But the moment you stop reacting, the lever breaks. Silence neutralizes emotional manipulation. Machiavellian thinking does not teach you how to manipulate. It teaches you how not to be manipulated. Ignoring strategically is defensive dominance. It removes the reward system from emotional games. Why silence creates status. Status is not confidence. Status is not money. Status is emotional independence. People with higher emotional independence can tolerate emotional ambiguity. They do not need reassurance. They do not need constant validation. They do not need emotional synchronization. Lower status individuals require emotional feedback to stabilize their self-image. So when you remain calm and silent during emotional turbulence, your nervous system becomes the reference point. You become the emotional anchor. Others start adjusting to your rhythm. That is silent leadership. The fourth principle, ignoring shifts the emotional frame. In every interaction, someone holds the frame. The frame is simply this: whose emotional reality dominates the moment. If someone provokes you and you react, you enter their emotional frame. If someone withdraws and you chase, you accept their emotional narrative. But when you remain silent and emotionally neutral, you refuse the frame. Machiavellian psychology values frame control above moral comfort, not because morality is useless, but because emotional leadership determines influence. Ignoring is not passive. It is refusal. Refusal to accept another person's emotional agenda. Why people come back after you ignore them. This confuses many men. They think ignoring someone makes them disappear. Sometimes it does. And that is not failure. That is filtration. But often people return. Why? Because unresolved emotional loops are addictive. When someone no longer receives predictable emotional reactions from you, their certainty collapses. You become psychologically unfinished business. The human mind seeks emotional closure more than emotional pleasure. Ignoring creates an open loop. And open loops demand attention. The dark side, when ignoring becomes cruel. Now we enter dangerous territory. Machiavellian thinking has no built-in empathy. But you do. There is a difference between protecting your emotional boundaries and intentionally destabilizing someone emotionally. Ignoring someone who is trying to communicate respectfully. Ignoring someone who is emotionally vulnerable. Ignoring someone to punish. This creates resentment, not power. Real power reduces conflict. It does not feed it. Use silence to protect your space, not to dominate fragile people. The strongest form of dominance is self-control, not emotional destruction. The fifth principle, ignoring reveals who respects you. Here is something very practical. If you stop chasing people, only two types remain: those who value your presence and those who valued your availability. Ignoring acts like a social filter. Respectful people adjust. Manipulative people escalate. Emotionally immature people dramatize. You don't need confrontation to learn who belongs in your life. Silence sorts your social environment for you. Why explaining yourself is often a weakness. Let me be brutally precise. Explanation is not strength when the other person has not earned it. When you explain too quickly, you teach others that they do not need to treat you carefully. They can provoke. You will repair. They can misinterpret. You will clarify. They can withdraw. You will chase. Machiavellian psychology exposes this uncomfortable truth. People respect boundaries they cannot cross emotionally. Silence creates psychological borders. The sixth principle, ignoring removes your need to be understood. One of the deepest emotional addictions in men is this: I just want her to understand me. Understanding is not attraction. Understanding is comfort. Comfort does not generate emotional polarity. Machiavellian thinking separates emotional safety from emotional influence. If you build your identity around being understood, you become dependent on emotional validation. Ignoring breaks that dependency. You stop negotiating your self-worth. You stop selling your intentions. You start existing without permission. That shift is deeply unsettling to people who rely on emotional control. How to use ignoring correctly. Practical rules. Let me give you concrete behavioral rules. Not theory, not philosophy. Real behavior. Rule 1. Do not ignore genuine respect. Silence is not a replacement for communication. Use it when emotional manipulation appears. Rule 2. Never announce your silence. The moment you say, "I am ignoring you," you lose power. Power is invisible. Rule 3. Never use silence to extract apologies. That is emotional bargaining, not emotional independence. Rule 4. Your silence must be busy, not dramatic. Live your life. Silence works only when your attention is genuinely elsewhere. The most ruthless truth of all. Here's the truth most people cannot accept. The more emotionally self-sufficient you become, the fewer people can emotionally reach you. That is the price, but it is also the reward. You become less reactive, less offended, less anxious, less dependent. Your nervous system stabilizes. You stop letting other people's emotional chaos rearrange your internal state. This is not social dominance. This is emotional sovereignty. Why this works so well in attraction? Let me be very clear and very honest. Attraction is not created by availability. Attraction is created by emotional contrast. A person who does not emotionally collapse under uncertainty signals psychological maturity, and psychological maturity is deeply attractive, not because it is manipulative, but because it feels safe. Unpredictable emotions create insecurity. Stable emotions create gravity. Ignoring unnecessary emotional noise protects your stability. The final Machiavellian insight. Machiavellian psychology does not tell you to become heartless. It tells you to stop being emotionally exploitable. There is a huge difference. Your kindness must come from strength, not from fear of losing people. Silence trains your nervous system to tolerate disconnection without panic, and the person who can tolerate emotional distance cannot be emotionally controlled. That is the most ruthless power of all. If you remember only one thing from this video, remember this. Ignoring people is not about rejecting them. It is about refusing emotional dependency. It is about refusing to build your identity around someone else's reactions. It is about refusing to live in a constant state of emotional alert, waiting for messages, waiting for tone changes, waiting for approval, waiting for reassurance, waiting to feel chosen. Most people don't realize how much of their daily stress comes from one silent habit. They keep giving other people permission to control their emotional state. A delayed reply can ruin their mood. A cold tone can destroy their confidence. A small change in behavior can make them doubt their entire value. And slowly, without noticing it, they become emotionally programmable, not by powerful people, but by unstable ones. That is what emotional dependency really looks like. Not love, not loyalty, but nervous system attachment to external signals. Ignoring people is not about pretending they don't exist. It is about deciding that your emotional stability will no longer be negotiated in every interaction. It is about refusing reactive living. Reactive living is when your mind and body move before your values do. Someone triggers you and you respond. Someone withdraws, you chase. Someone disapproves, you shrink. Someone approves, you expand. Your self-image rises and falls based on someone else's emotional weather. That is not connection. That is emotional survival mode. When you begin to practice silence, real silence, not dramatic silence, something inside you starts to reset. You begin to notice how often you speak just to repair tension, how often you explain just to avoid discomfort, how often you apologize for emotions that were never wrong, how often you lower your boundaries to stay emotionally safe. Ignoring breaks that cycle, not by making you colder, but by making you slower. And slower is powerful, because when you stop reacting instantly, you start choosing deliberately. It is also about refusing to let other people's moods dictate your identity. This is one of the deepest psychological traps in modern relationships. Someone wakes up in a bad mood, and suddenly you start questioning yourself. Someone becomes distant, and suddenly you start auditing your personality. Someone loses interest, and suddenly you start rewriting your worth. But another person's emotional state is not a verdict on your value. It is only a reflection of their internal world. When you stop personalizing other people's emotions, you reclaim emotional authorship over your own life. Silence is not cold. Silence is disciplined. Coldness comes from resentment. Silence comes from emotional strength. Coldness tries to punish. Silence protects. Silence is self-respect. Because self-respect is not loud. It does not argue for its right to exist. It does not justify itself in emotional court. It does not perform stability. It simply withdraws access when access is misused. Silence is emotional leadership, not because others follow you, but because you stop following. Emotional chaos. Leadership always begins internally. If you cannot lead your own impulses, your own anxieties, your own need to be validated, you will always be vulnerable to emotional influence the moment you learn to sit comfortably inside your own emotional space, without rushing to fill it with messages, explanations, or reassurance. You experience a different kind of power, a quiet power, a grounded power, a power that does not need witnesses. You stop chasing attention, because attention no longer confirms your existence. You stop chasing validation, because your nervous system no longer depends on external approval to feel safe. You stop chasing clarity, because you finally understand that not everything needs emotional closure, and you stop chasing people, not because you hate them, not because you are bitter, but because you no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional value. Here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. The more emotionally stable you become, the less available you are for emotional games. You become harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, harder to emotionally destabilize. And yes, some people will slowly drift away from you, not because you became worse, but because you stopped feeding the version of yourself they could control. That is not loss. That is alignment. When your presence no longer comes with emotional dependency attached, it becomes cleaner, calmer, stronger. People who genuinely respect you will feel safer around you. People who relied on emotional leverage will feel uncomfortable around you. And that contrast is healthy. This is what real emotional maturity looks like. Not dramatic detachment, not emotional shutdown, not pretending you don't care, but the ability to care without collapsing, to connect without clinging, to love without losing emotional sovereignty. Because the goal of silence is not distance. The goal of silence is internal freedom. Freedom from emotional reflexes, freedom from approval addiction, freedom from the need to be constantly emotionally understood. And once your presence no longer needs permission to exist, once you stop explaining yourself just to be tolerated, once you stop shrinking yourself to maintain emotional harmony, you become psychologically grounded, unshakable, not aggressive, not dominant, but deeply stable. And in a world full of emotional noise, emotional stability becomes rare. It becomes magnetic. It becomes quietly powerful. And that is the real art of ignoring people.